Welcome everyone to our second quarter virtual event put on by the Gluten Intolerance Group, Staying Safely Gluten-Free at Home and Beyond. We're delighted to have a panel of 3 experts with us tonight to discuss various aspects of this topic. My name is Lola O'Rourke. I'm the education specialist at the Gluten Intolerance Group, and I'm also a registered dietitian. And I'll be moderating the panel tonight. Before we get started, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Gluten Intolerance Group for those who are not familiar. We are about to celebrate our 48th year of existence, and our mission at GIG, as the Gluten Intolerance Group is also known, is to make life easier for everyone living gluten-free. And there really are sort of 3 main approaches to how we accomplish that. One is through providing support and support groups. Another is through food safety. And then the third is through education. So a little bit more about each of those. In terms of support, GIG actually was founded by a dietitian here in the Seattle area who had celiac disease patients and realized that they needed some education, help, and support. So that was how we started. We now have a network of about 80 support groups across the country, including 20 or so, which are geared specifically towards children. And these are places where, of course, people can simply connect with others who are living gluten-free, obtain education, information, share information about local restaurants, food, etc. And some research has shown that people with celiac disease tend to do better in terms of adherence to the gluten-free diet, as well as quality of life when they're involved in support groups like this. So that's one. And then next is our food safety programs. The first of these is the Gluten-Free Certification Organization, which certifies tens of thousands of products around the world as being safely gluten-free. We have very high standards and go through very in-depth processes of auditing, review, product testing, et cetera, so that consumers can be confident in the safety of these products. Our second food safety program is the Gluten-Free Food Services Validation Program. This program does something somewhat similar, but for food service institutions. So that includes restaurants, hospitals, college dining halls, even food trucks and meal delivery services. We work with these facilities, look at their physical setups, of course, their ingredients, where they're preparing foods, how they're preparing foods, how they're training their staff, how they're serving, everything that could be impacting their ability to serve safe gluten-free food. And then third is education, which really permeates just about everything that we do. We provide education on virtually all aspects of living gluten-free, from the nuts and bolts of what is gluten and how to read labels for those who are just getting started, to things like how to have a heart-healthy gluten-free diet and considerations with regard to medications and gluten, traveling while gluten-free, looking into assisted living facilities if you're gluten-free. So really the whole gamut of aspects to living gluten-free. And this is all available on our website at gluten.org. We also publish a magazine called Generation GF for our kids groups, which is educational for them. And then, of course, we do a variety of other things. This event is one good example of an educational activity, which, by the way, is sort of kicking off our Celiac Awareness Month events. So we're delighted to be doing this. And I do want to tell you about one really unusual event that we have coming up that I would say falls into the category of both support and education. A few years ago, we started some teen summits, and these are events specifically for teenagers where they could really get together, connect with other teens who are living gluten-free, learn, engage, and they really had a great time at these events, and we got a lot of positive feedback. And one of the things we heard is that for a future event, they wanted a cooking event. So we are having the Gluten-Free Teen Chef Camp this summer. It's a 2-day event at the Culinary Institute of America in Napa, which is one of the preeminent cooking schools. So it'll be very cool. Kids will go and actually learn with these professionals how to cook gluten-free. So I'm just going to mention that if you have any teens who are gluten-free or know of any teens, I encourage you to check it out on our website. There is still space available, and I believe we even have some scholarships available. So it promises to be a really fun and exciting event. With that, I think I will go ahead and introduce our panelists. First, we have Dr. Joe Murray. Dr. Murray is a professor of medicine and a consultant with a joint appointment in immunology and gastroenterology and hepatology at the Mayo Clinic. His training in gastroenterology and population health, as well as his broad experience in clinical, translational, population, and basic research, provides him with a wide-ranging perspective of the discipline of gastroenterology, and most specifically in celiac disease. He has published over 400 original articles, many on the topic of celiac disease. His research has ranged from basic work to clinical trials. He has also participated in guideline development and has been the senior author on guidelines related to celiac disease. Thank you very much, Dr. Murray, for being with us. And we have Laura K. Allred, PhD. Laura, waiting for her to pop up there, is the Regulatory and Standards Manager for the Gluten Intolerance Group's Gluten-Free Certification Organization, GFCO. Laura oversees the safety and compliance of GFCO certified products. Her experience includes a background in immunology and 8 years of directing a food testing laboratory and test kit manufacturing operation. Thank you very much, Laura, for being with us and sharing your expertise. And we have Ronnie Alicia. Ronnie is a registered dietitian with extensive experience in gluten-free food and supplement production, along with commercial and non-commercial consumer gluten-free food service. She has been active assuring gluten-free products are safe since 1997. Currently, Ronnie is the manager of quality control for the Gluten-Free Certification Organization, assuring competent auditing for the Gluten Intolerance Group after having been an auditor herself for 10 years. Thank you very much, Ronnie, for being with us. Okay, so to kick things off, we're going to ask one quick poll question to assess where our attendees stand really on this issue of staying safely gluten-free at home and beyond, with reference specifically to cross-contact, which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight. Cross-contact, in the past often known as cross-contamination, really refers to when foods are basically themselves gluten-free, but exposed to gluten either inadvertently in the home, in the field, in a restaurant, or in other settings. So Jeannie, if you would post the poll question, we can get a quick pulse on where people stand. I'm talking to one of my colleagues behind the scenes here. I think we'll be taking a look at the results of the poll a little bit later on. Thank you. So to set the stage, Dr. Murray, I would like to start with you, really. You know, we know that many people who think that they are following a gluten-free diet quite well, they feel knowledgeable about it, are conscientious, that in fact, many people are still being exposed to gluten. I think there's been some research in the last couple of years that has indicated that this is the case. So I'm wondering if you could comment on the degree to which this is, you know, something that people need to be concerned about, and what your experience is with this as well.
I mean, excellent question. I'm delighted to be here, and I love voting. Anyway, so more polls. The issue about what actually happens in real life in people living world of being celiac, of living gluten-free, is that it probably is not gluten-free for a substantial proportion. Now, it probably varies on the people. It varies over time. But a couple of studies that have been done using test kits where you can test the stool or the urine of individuals who have celiac disease and claim to be gluten-free can find anywhere between 5 and 40% of people will be exposed to measurable gluten that's gotten into their system. It's not just in their food, but it's by measuring in their urine or in their stool, you will find gluten in it. So that's, I think, was shocking to many of us that it was actually that high. Now, there's also been another study, Jocelyn Sylvester, who's in Boston, originally Canadian, from Canada, did a study called the doggy bag study, where they asked people to bring in samples of all of their food and tested it, also found traces of gluten. So living in the real world, living as normal a life as possible, and still patients who are well educated and well understand the issues relating to celiac disease are still getting exposed. What does that? It is real. Now, there are people who take extreme measures, and probably even particularly during the pandemic when there was a lot less eating out, people naturally were probably end up being exposed less than they were. Though, of course, once we get back to real life, it's going to be a gluten, it's a gluten permeated environment.
Correct, exactly. Thank you for that. And, so the main places really where we're all potentially exposed are, in our homes with the foods that we purchase and bring in, or when we eat out at restaurants or go to friends' homes. So really what we want to do tonight too is address, what we as consumers can do to mitigate those risks. And then we'll want to hear a little bit more from you too, Dr. Murray, as we go on about, how important this is in terms of promoting the best physical outcomes and mitigating any real clinical issues. So Laura, I'm going to turn to you since you work with the GFCO certification program. And I wonder if you could comment. Say you're a person who knows the basics of what is gluten-free, and you go to the store and you choose a product that appears to be gluten-free completely based on its ingredients. There's no certification, there's no labeling, but the ingredients are, milk, cheese, I don't know, something that's just completely gluten-free. Are you good to go, or are there risks in some of those products?
Wow. Well, you've brought up an interesting one with milk and cheese. One of the things we're going through right now is the adoption of the FDA regulation on fermented and hydrolyzed foods. If you read through that regulation, it says, well, things in the dairy industry, they use cultures and they use enzymes, but they're used in such small quantities, they're not really an issue. So they've aimed the regulation more at things that are pure culture materials or things that are used at high percent, like yeast extracts and probiotics, things that you might take in, as a culture in their entirety.
So
but
Laura,
what we're finding, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just want to interrupt you for 1 second, excuse me, and to see if you could explain a little bit about the whole issue with fermented foods, which I think some people may not be familiar with. Why is that even different?
Sure. So products which have been either fermented or hydrolyzed, things like enzymes, yeast, cultures, probiotics, anything that kind of grows in a petri dish kind of deal. Those tend to break down proteins as part of their digestion process. And the current test kits on the market are all antibody based, and they're used to seeing intact proteins. So sometimes when proteins are broken down by fermentation or hydrolysis, the antibodies in the test kits can't see those proteins anymore. But we've done a little research on this at GIG. People with celiac disease have a wide repertoire of antibodies against gluten, and their antibodies can often still detect these residual proteins after fermentation or hydrolysis. So that's was the impetus for the FDA regulation, basically that the current test methods we have don't work for fermented or hydrolyzed products.
So it sounds like you're saying, if a person chooses a product that contains one of these fermented foods, so no obvious sources of gluten, this could be a potential source of cross contact in essence.
It could be. And again, you brought up one that, most people think, well, dairy products not really a thing, but we're finding from obtaining documentation from various manufacturers that a lot of the enzymes and a lot of the cultures used in dairy products are originally grown on media that contains wheat or barley or a yeast extract that was grown on barley. So when you because we can't then test to determine how much gluten that's contributing, we have to assume that that culture material, is gluten containing. And when we calculate out how much potential gluten that might introduce into a finished product, it's often well over our 10 ppm threshold. So, we're doing a lot of work with our clients, trying to get everybody up to speed on that FDA regulation. And, it's one of the things people might not think to look at.
So this is definitely an area. So things are not as simple as they seem, for sure. And we'll certainly get back to this, but, and then Ronnie, I want to bring you in, because I think that most people who are living gluten-free will say that certainly one of their main concerns is being able to go out and eat out and socialize with other people, where you just don't have a lot of control over things. So I'm wondering if you could comment on, to what degree do those scenarios contribute to the risk, and what can people do? What should they do to try to mitigate those risks?
Well, we were making great headway as far as eating out. FDA said that the person in charge of the restaurant had to be a food professional, right? They had to go through something called Serve Safe, right? So, and this all happened, and then the pandemic hit, right? So we were all eating at home, and after the pandemic, we had a labor shortage. So all these restaurants that were closed down all of a sudden had trained people, and now are maybe not having people that are as well trained as they should be. And this is a serious problem. So restaurants where you typically thought were safe, they may have hired their people 2 days ago because they're and not had the time to train them. So we were making headway and have had to take a step back. So we just have to be a little bit more cautious eating out, and go back to, for those of you newly gluten-free, you don't remember 10 years ago when we really queried our servers a little bit more than we had to with the advent of gluten-free menus. Because as much as we would love to say, well, I went to Ronnie's Bar and Grill and she has a gluten-free menu, if the server does not tell the kitchen what I asked, it's off for naught. So that is a challenge that we have right now dealing with our servers. So I do implore people to be cautious in eating at busy times right now, even in establishments where, say, 2 years ago, you went in and were successfully dining, unless you truly know that they're keyed into your support group. As Lola said, having local resources is important.
Well, you bring up a good point about the pandemic. I mean, I think even before the pandemic, when gluten-free was becoming such a trend and restaurants wanted to jump on the bandwagon, it was the same thing. They probably were using ingredients that appeared to be gluten-free, but without even being aware of their need to be cautious regarding cross-contamination, et cetera, in the kitchen.
I'm sorry. One of the challenges we have is that Mintel did some research, and they say 44% of people asking a restaurant for a gluten-free diet don't need to be. It's a lifestyle choice. So it's frustrating because they'll say, well, all right, I'm eating my gluten-free meal, but can I have some crackers? Yeah, it sends mixed messages to servers saying, oh, you're gluten-free. So we do all have to be a little bit more cautious.
Right, sort of muddies the waters. And turning back to you, Dr. Murray, what can you tell us about what you see in patients, and in terms of, do patients have symptoms and they come in and they're sort of reassessed by a dietitian, and this is what sometimes leads to realizing they're experiencing cross-contact. And then, of course, there are those people with celiac disease who don't even have any overt symptoms. So I'm wondering, how should people think about monitoring their own situations? Should they be, there are things you can test your food when you go to a restaurant. You can do urine and stool tests.
So I see two scenarios. I see the people who are, what's the French term, la belle défense. They feel quite happy and are indifferent to what's going on. They don't get symptoms, as you said, they're eating out and they're getting exposed to gluten. And when I evaluate them, either by blood tests or by biopsies, I find you still have a lot of activity of your disease. And maybe they have symptoms, but their symptoms are not associated in time with the exposure. It's not that they eat out on a Monday evening and they have symptoms Monday night or Tuesday morning. They may be exposed several times a week, but their symptoms are chronic and they don't actually link it to the events of when they're eating out. So that's the group who are having injury. They don't really realize it. And they can have significant health consequences. So that's
and so they would only be caught if you're doing a routine follow-up and looking at their blood work and then perhaps.
And what I will do with those patients now is, obviously they meet with the dietitian, we review their practices, but are they being careful? As Ronnie has said, are they actually doing their due diligence? And as Ronnie said, we have to be more vigilant now because all of these, or many restaurants have complete turnovers of staff. So, and I think somebody estimated that it's over 50% of all food consumed in the US is prepared outside the home. I mean, that's an incredible, now that's probably much higher than many people who live gluten-free do, who tend to cook at home, but it's still a very high percentage. And certainly for many of the young professionals that I see, it's probably 70 to 80% of their food is prepared outside the home. And if they're trying to live gluten-free, there's a lot of potential exposures.
Yeah.
The second group I see are the people who will have a lot of symptoms. They will report every time they eat out, they got contaminated and they got terribly ill. And some of those are undoubtedly due to gluten, but some might not be due to gluten. And you might say, well, what would make you sick? Well, there are many things that can upset our GI tract. Apart from food poisoning, there are things like eating too much fat, too much fiber, foods with too many sugary alcohols in them, artificially sweetened, for example, eating too fast or eating too much. All of those things are things that can upset anyone's GI tract, but especially people who already have a challenged or injured GI tract, like patients with celiac disease. So there is a whole spectrum of experience and exposure. With regard to, say, urine and stool tests, there's still some questions about how accurate they are, but I think they can be a useful tool for people who do eat out a lot and who either are experiencing symptoms or I'm telling them that they're experiencing consequences. We want to try and help them identify where are they getting the food, where are they getting gluten exposure. So those are the ways I approach some of those types of reports and interactions with patients.
Yeah, okay, very interesting. And I wonder at this point, I think it would be useful, Ronnie and I were talking about this earlier, what is it the actual amount of gluten that is problematic? We hear 20 parts per million, 10 parts per million, 10 milligrams of gluten is thought to be sort of the safe cutoff amount for people with celiac disease. But what does that look like in terms of a little flour or?
Well, there's a threshold. There's a threshold that we have to reach for even a small percentage of patients with celiac disease to have a reaction. I tell patients that for some patients that can be as little as a very big crumb. Now, that's a very big crumb of bread. That's not a crouton. That's a big crumb. In some people can be enough or sufficient to produce a response, an immune response. Now, we do a lot of challenge studies in patients with treated celiac disease as part of some of these new efforts to develop new treatments for celiac disease. And what's remarkable is across that spectrum of people, you will see people who get lots of symptoms right away, even with very small doses. And then you have other patients with celiac disease who you give them a boatload of gluten, well, it's not that much, but you give them the equivalent of a slice of bread or two a day, and they don't seem to get injury or symptoms after 6 weeks of that, even though they didn't get the active drug, whatever that was. So that tells me that there is a very wide spectrum. Now, for years, we were stuck when we would see patients who had already been gluten-free and were trying to make a diagnosis and they didn't have any testing done. We put them on a gluten challenge. And I have had a patient where we had to go for a year and a half before they redeveloped celiac disease. Now, that's a lot of gluten exposure, and the longest on record is 14 years. But the immune system of celiac disease has got a very deep memory. And once you wake up that memory, it is unforgiving. It will generate a response in the intestine. There will be damage. And the more exposed somebody is to gluten, the worse that damage will get. So it's a very variable recall in terms of the memory of the immune system and recall. But I have patients where it's the tiniest amount, the airborne. I saw a message coming across on chat, a little bit of airborne flour. That doesn't seem like much, but it can be. I tell somebody, if you can put your hand on the surface and you see white flour on your hand, that's enough. If it got into your nose, it'll eventually get into your esophagus and down into your stomach and your intestine. That is enough to cause injury in some people. So it depends, of course, on what how risk averse they are. If they really want to be healthy and they want to keep healthy, then that big crumb is the threshold.
Yeah, so a lot of individual variability. So it's very complicated, really, because a person can't necessarily know what their threshold is, right? Some people have symptoms, some don't. And then another aspect of all of this is balancing quality of life. If that involves, food-oriented events, which it does for most people, and participating in community events, going out to eat with friends, et cetera, with adherence to the gluten-free diet. And sort of hypervigilance can have a really negative impact on people's quality of life. So I'm wondering if you could comment on how you recommend people approach that sort of dilemma.
Well, when I meet, say, a new patient that I've not met before, newly diagnosed, I set goals. I tell them, for the next few months, you're going to learn all about what you cannot eat. But your life, maybe 2-3 years from now, should not be about what you can't do. It should be about what you can do. And you should not be defined by celiac disease. You're going to incorporate those safety measures, but your life should not be defined by the disease. That's not, the quality of life that we would aim for. Prudence, not paranoia. Be prudent, but you don't have to be paranoid. Can you go places where there is gluten? Yes, you can. Now, I did see a message flash by on pizza places. Well, if you go into a pizza place occasionally, it's probably safe. It depends on what you eat, of course. But if you work in a pizza place, that's a whole other issue. If you have airborne flour, it's going to get in your eyes, in your nose, in your mouth. It's going to get in your system. So I don't think it's safe for a person with celiac disease to work in a pizza place. Sometimes other type of bakeries as well that use regular flour, unless they're taking really extreme measures, eye protection and a proper dust exclusion mask or even respirator, I think is required. And is it worth it to do that? Probably not.
And this, I think, brings up an interesting question, which Ronnie, you may be able to comment on, that in our GFFS validation program, when we go into restaurants, that's certainly one of the things we look at, because it's not as if we only work with restaurants which are strictly gluten-free, right? They may be working with wheat flour or gluten-containing products, but we look at their air filtration systems. We look at how they segregate what they're doing. And I think the same thing applies for GFCO certified products, right, Laura? That all of those things have an effect. So it's not just that a facility, whether it's food manufacturing or food service, be exclusively gluten-free. It's how they manage the arrangement of things that are going on in the facility. Ronnie, could you comment a bit on some of those factors in kitchens? And it seems to me those are some of the things that could be impacting cross-contact in restaurant kitchens, for sure.
Correct. So what we have is we have restaurants that say we're gonna provide, say, a gluten-free pizza. So are they going to the consumer? We have to say, if you're going to provide a gluten-free pizza, ask the right questions. We still have to ask, is there a dedicated area that you're preparing this pizza? Is it frozen? Are you taking it from the freezer and putting it on what's called a barrier, on parchment paper? Are you putting it right into the oven? The other option is to go to a GFFS validated or a facility that maybe your support group has had a relationship with, and they have been specifically trained. Right. So there are ways to make yourself safe. If you're just going on vacation on a road trip and stop in and you see a little sign say we have gluten-free pizza and in the corner of a window, I would ask a few more questions on how do you, Mr. Restaurant,
Yeah.
keep me safe, right? And don't be afraid to leave, to walk out, or to order a salad and watch them make it, so they don't put the croutons on and take it off, right? So,
Right, exactly. And clearly remembering, as we've said, that not only during COVID, but always restaurant staff are generally extremely busy. They don't have the full picture of what this means to you. And so sometimes they just do whatever they can do to get food out.
And then they all have an aunt that came to Thanksgiving that was gluten-free, and she ate the pie crust, she ate the pumpkin pie and not the crust because she thought gluten-free was healthier, right? So people have don't understand, for people with celiac disease, that crumbs count.
Yeah. So Laura, I'd like to go back to you for a minute with regard to, purchasing products at the store. Could you talk a little bit about the distinction between products that are labeled gluten-free, that therefore should be complying with the FDA definition of gluten-free, what that means, versus the GFCO certification in terms of potential risk or safety for consumers?
Sure. We can't make a lot of comments about things that are just labeled gluten-free because we don't, as GFCO, we don't see how they're made. But the benefit of the GFCO certification is you have an independent third party going in and making sure that companies are doing the right things to make a truly gluten-free product. You just talked about, if it's a shared facility in like a restaurant, well, we have shared facilities in manufacturing as well. And with our program, we can make sure people are doing the right things in terms of changeover cleanings, testing equipment, surface swabbing kind of testing to make sure they've adequately cleaned before they make a gluten-free product. And so what you get with the certification is basically, a third party coming in and looking and making sure they're doing things the right way. The other thing, that you get with a certified product as opposed to just labeled a gluten-free product is we keep up on a lot of the regulations, like I just talked about, the FDA concerns about fermented and hydrolyzed foods. But there are a lot of other foods that food manufacturers might not realize right off the bat are a gluten concern. And we review every ingredient that's used in certified products. And we still to this day catch a lot of stuff and stop people from using ingredients that shouldn't be going into products. And Ronnie laughs because she sees it all the time. So yeah, she knows what I'm saying.
Right?
I wonder if you could comment on a couple other things, Laura, in terms of foods that people are purchasing and bringing into their homes. So what about things like lentils? Well, lentils are gluten-free, right? You don't have to worry about they're being certified. Are you good with that?
Well, yes, the lentils themselves are gluten-free, but there's something that happens, as Dr. Murray said, wheat's kind of everywhere. It's ubiquitous. And certainly within the grain industry, it's even more ubiquitous. And there's, within the USDA grain definitions, there are allowances for percentages of other grains that can be in those. So, if you buy a USDA #1 corn, because it's USDA #1, that means it can only have 2% of other grains in it. And so 2% works out to, 2,000 parts per million if it's, a wheat that's about 10% gluten. So, You hope that those manufacturers that are selling you whole grain products or products that contain grains and simply labeling them gluten-free, you hope that they are aware of all that and, you know what to look out for, know when to test, know how to vet their suppliers, know how to clean those grains up if they're a grain processor. But yeah, with certification, we take a lot of that guesswork out for you.
So it sounds like with those sorts of products that are potentially more exposed to wheat, at least it's wise to choose labeled gluten-free products. And because the thinking is that there is some awareness of those products meeting the FDA definition. Which I think a lot of people think that that's not necessary for a single ingredient item that is naturally gluten-free. So that could be one source of potential cross contact.
Definitely.
Yeah, and one other thing, I wonder if you could comment on, we hear about this all the time, concern about may contain statements or processed in a facility that also processes wheat. I mean, we're just talking about this, an airborne wheat. Is that something people should be concerned about? Is that a potential source of cross contact in gluten-free foods? Say you have it just says processed in a facility that handles wheat.
Yeah, so those statements all stem from FALCPA, the allergen labeling regulation from the FDA. And they use those statements because unlike gluten, so you guys may all know wheat is a gluten source, it's also an allergen. Rye and barley are gluten sources, but they're not considered allergens. So those may contain and shared equipment statements are all about wheat as an allergen. And I know I hear a lot of doctors will tell their patients with celiac disease, oh, you have a gluten allergy, but it's really not a gluten allergy. So there's celiac disease and then wheat allergy. So those statements are there because for gluten, we have thresholds. We have regulatory thresholds. The FDA's 20 ppm threshold, true across most countries. But for wheat as an allergen, there is no defined threshold. So companies can test and verify that there is no gluten, there's undetectable gluten in their products, but because they have wheat somewhere in their facility, they can never feel comfortable saying, I have a low enough wheat level that I know it's not an allergy concern, because they don't know what that level is. No one's defined that for them. So yeah, those statements are really about wheat as an allergen and not about celiac concerns. And if a product is labeled gluten-free or if it's certified gluten-free and it has a may contain statement, it's still gluten-free. It still meets that 20 ppm or 10 ppm threshold. They just don't know if it meets whatever wheat allergy threshold hasn't been
if
set
it's a
yet.
product that is not certified or labeled gluten-free, but the ingredients appear gluten-free and it has one of those statements, then a consumer is perhaps better off avoiding that choice. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, again, from everything we've just talked about, particularly if it's grain-based product, between agricultural commingling and, it not being labeled gluten-free, I would probably, steer away from those. I would recommend if you can find one that's at least labeled gluten-free, that the manufacturer's at least thinking, and making a conscious decision to put that on their packaging, should tell you they're taking a few more steps than just a random bag of lentils that, doesn't say anything on it.
So we are already almost running out of town. They're out of time. I had one question I did want to ask you, Dr. Murray, that we haven't addressed. It's kind of taking a bit of a turn here, but I know people are always wondering, if they get what they call glutened and are not feeling well, what should they do to feel better? Is there anything they can do, or what do you recommend?
Well, there are a few things. One is to make sure they're hydrated. So if you think of what is the reaction, so if somebody with celiac disease gets a big dose of gluten accidentally, and of course it happens, what can they do? They're going to start feeling unwell. Some patients will vomit right away, and that's not terrible because it gets a lot of that gluten out of them. But let's say they don't vomit it all up. I recommend don't take an antidiarrheal like Imodium, at least not for the first 12 hours. You want that gluten out of your system. I probably wouldn't purge the person either. I wouldn't suggest they take a laxative or a purge to do it either. It'll probably get fairly rapidly broken down within the gut and dealt with within about probably 4 to 8 hours.
Okay.
Most people will ride it out taking some type of hydration solution. And there are now some of these very nice hydration solutions you can get. You mix with water. They're better than hydrating with water. That can certainly help. If somebody has if they have a history of getting vomiting, for a day or so, it might be worthwhile having a prescription or even a supply of some anti-nauseant that you can take under your tongue, for example. One of these dissolve ondansetron is one, for example. So having something like that can sometimes help. But basically, it's write it out as best you can. Don't keep eating. So if you've eaten something with gluten, don't say, oh, I'll dilute it out with other stuff. Don't do that. Okay. Because that'll just challenge your gut further. Yeah. Most people will recover fine. I have a few patients who get severe or have gotten severe neurologic syndromes. And occasionally I've given them a supply of prednisone. Now that's pretty extreme. Wow. But they take, usually 3 days of prednisone, like a Medrol pack, something like that, to try and blunt the inflammatory response. But that's very rare. I think I probably only do that about once a year. So that would be very rare. Mostly it's avoidance. The other thing I do tell people, I said, if you take a bite of something and you realize, oh gosh, I think this is a real gluten containing cookie, don't eat the rest of it. Okay. That is turning a bad situation much worse. A little is bad, but a lot is worse. Yeah. So, and that's sometimes human nature. Oh, heck, I've already eaten. I may as well just keep going. Close my eyes and just do it. Don't.
Okay. And I think it would be worthwhile to touch on one other thing, which is the fact that there is no product on the market right now which will allow someone to take it like a glutenase type thing that will break the gluten down, because we hear about that all the time. And I think everyone wants that to exist. And there is some research on things that function similarly that may exist in the future. But I wonder if you could comment on that, Dr. Murray.
Yeah, so there are a number of products out there that are basically under the supplement or additive type things. And they purport to be enzymes that might break down gluten, but there's very little evidence that they actually do. And there's no evidence that they protect patients with celiac disease from the damaging effects of gluten. So they don't work. It's really, if somebody thinks that this type of enzyme makes somebody who doesn't have celiac disease thinks it might help them, probably doesn't make any difference. But patients with celiac disease should not use or rely on these to protect them from exposure to gluten.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I think we have had a lot of questions coming in, and they are being compiled in the background by my colleagues. So I think we'll start taking some of these questions.
All right. Yes, we have a lot of questions coming through, and some of them are things that have already been discussed, but might need some clarity. So we have actually half a dozen questions about the dairy products comment that happened toward the beginning. Is regular milk safe? Is milk and cheese safe? What about cultures? If somebody could, and Lola, you can choose who will speak to this, clarify just clearly dairy products and the cultures for yogurt or fermented cottage cheese, etc. Because most of the questions came in just around that.
I think that's in your court, clearly, Laura.
Yes, sorry, I stirred that pot up. So we're talking about cultured dairy products, so not milk. Milk should be perfectly gluten-free, unless, people are adding flavorings. I think you might want to look into that, but just plain milk is good. So where we have seen some issues, and again, this isn't widespread, I wouldn't say, you need to worry about every cultured dairy product, but we have seen some cheese products, some yogurt products where the cultures have been grown in a gluten-containing media at a level where we are concerned about it exceeding our 10 ppm threshold. These companies that we work with are generally reformulating or having their culture suppliers reformulate so we can get that out. But part of why I brought up the dairy stuff in the beginning, and yeah, buttermilk falls into that category, is because the FDA specifically called it out in the regulation saying, oh, we don't view this as being a problem in dairy products where cultures are used at small levels. We are seeing that in some few cases, it can be problematic. So, you know, you can ask the manufacturer about their cultures and enzymes. That's certainly something you can do, or you can simply look for certified products where we've taken that out of the equation.
And Dr. Murray, I'm wondering if you have any input on this. Again, back to the question of, you know, how much risk is too much risk? How do consumers take in this information and balance things out?
And I think Laura alluded to this. It's what is the mass of the material? So if you have something, a culture that is, for example, cultured on a grain product, or even wheat, take cultured on grain, and then you separate off the culture material, you separate off the bacteria, the yeast, and then you use that purified yeast in something that's inherently gluten-free. How much gluten does that drag with it, if any? And then when you dilute it in the bigger mass of your finished material, does that reach that threshold that could be damaging or could trigger a response? So it is a matter of where does it start now, unless somebody like Laura is getting to the manufacturers and talking to the formulators and saying, well, how many ounces of stuff are you putting in 100 pounds of finished material? And then does that calculation? It's a little hard to know. I have come in a sea change when it comes. I've been in celiac disease for over 30 years, and it used to be you had to look at the ingredients and hope that they put all the ingredients on the list, and then try and guess if those ingredients were gluten-free or not. Now I tell people that unless there's a gluten-free label on the product, don't trust it. I mean, now if it's like a bag of lentils, you can at least use your eyes to look and, oh, are there any wheat seeds in there? But if it's a processed food and it does not say gluten-free, I'm very hesitant to include it in my diet. Okay, the FALPA, that's that Food Allergy Act, will take care of wheat, but it won't catch rye or barley, which is where a lot of malted ingredients, etc., sneak into things. So unless it says gluten-free on the label, that means some manufacturer is putting their reputation on the line by putting that label on it. Why would I trust it? And if it's a frequent intake, if it's a once in a 6 months that you use something, it probably doesn't matter in the greater scheme of things. But if it's something you're going to use regularly, I want that label on it. Now, and I think Laura brought up a very good issue, which is, was it agricultural mixing or cross? There's all these giant bulk carriers, and they might carry wheat one day, and they might carry pea flour another day, and they might carry oat flour another day. They're not cleaning those out to the level that we would want. And if you happen to end up with something made from the batch that is heavily contaminated, that's a problem. So I at least suggest people look for labeling. Now, hopefully with labeling, then you've got at least some expectation that somebody is hopefully at least testing or source verifying what they're doing. But Laura and Ronnie can probably attest much better on how people actually do that as manufacturers.
Yeah, but at least then there are plenty of certified and labeled products available now, thankfully. Much different.
I have a question, right? Dr. Murray, has the medical community finalized? I saw a comment. Do we test people like an A1C? We would test a diabetic and say, oh, you are managing. So the absence of a normal A1C, you're down as 6.1. Are we encouraging people to get their TTG, a serological testing done, and even when they don't have antibodies?
Okay, so the TTG test, for example, it's an aid to diagnosis, and that's how it's approved, or at least cleared. Okay. It's not approved by FDA, it's cleared by the FDA. And they say, okay, use that as an aid to diagnosis. It's not approved at all as a management tool, though we often use it.
You said it right.
If somebody's TTG antibodies are still positive after 2 years on a gluten-free diet, the chances are they're getting gluten. I mean, I tell that to patients. I mean, there are a few exceptions, people who've got false positives, but in general, it means they're getting gluten. And they're getting gluten in significant quantities. And they are likely, if we biopsy their intestine, it's likely to have significant damage. And there's no way around that. Now, where it's coming from, where that gluten is coming from, that's the detective part. There are always, and I will have patients who will tell me, there are exceptions. There are people who have very funky immune systems that continue to generate antibodies even long after their intestine is healed. So there are exceptions to that. But that's generally how we use it. And ultimately, if a patient is having problems, or also patients who never had symptoms, but they want to know if they're doing okay, I'll biopsy their intestine. And if their intestine is healed and they've got good looking villi, I will tell them that whatever they're doing is satisfactory now.
So how many, like how often would you do that? Like
for the blood test, if somebody has achieved, so in my practice, if somebody's diagnosed with biopsies, I will rescope them and biopsy them again after 2 years to make sure they've healed. And once they achieve healing, not all will have achieved healing, but once they've achieved healing, I graduate them. And I say, look, every 2 years, check in with your doctor, get a TTG or one of these antibody tests done, and stick with your diet. If you fall off the wagon, then come back and see me. And I won't browbeat you and I won't give out to you. It's figuring out how do we get you back to a place where you're healthy. Yeah. And I think, I suppose it's taken me decades to learn this. It's not just about achieving one goal that I have. It's about helping patients to live the best health life they can with this condition. And that's a much bigger ask. It's just as much about social and psychological health as it is about intestinal health.
Right. We're really seeing a lot more emphasis on and focus on quality of life and that aspect of living with celiac disease or living gluten-free.
I will comment, though, that if somebody's having bad GI symptoms from their celiac disease, their quality of life will stink.
Exactly. Exactly. All right. Eliza, do we have more questions?
Oh, gosh, we have so many questions. And I just wanted to point out that if we don't get to your question this evening, we will be composing a blog post to follow up that will also have the recording on, but that will answer some of these additional questions because we've barely scratched the surface. Well, I was just going to say there are 2 quick questions that could be easily clarified by Laura about GFCO. One is, how often does GFCO recertify or the companies, and do auditors go to the facilities unannounced?
Recertification is annual. We audit every year, but we have communication with the companies a lot more frequently than that. They have to submit their testing data to us for review every quarter. We do proficiency testing rounds with them to make sure they know how to do their testing properly. So we do have a lot of interaction with them. And yes, our contracts do include the ability to do unannounced audits.
I just want to add in that I think that we are all the 3 panelists are available to stay on for an extra 15 minutes or so. So we do have time for more questions than we had thought, which is great.
Oh, excellent. Well, we have a number of questions came in related to the FDA. And one was answered in chat, but it might be worth talking about to clarify. There's 20 ppm, which has been mentioned, and then 10 ppm that has been mentioned. Can somebody discuss the differences there, because everyone thought 20 ppm was the safe threshold, and yet we're mentioning 10?
Well, I can address the issue of the 20 ppm. So the FDA had a very rigorous process where they use this kind of toxicology approach. It's okay, well, where do we think there's a threshold for causing harm? And this was based on some microdose studies, which identified maybe 50 to 100 milligrams of gluten. as sufficient to produce symptoms in a small proportion of celiac patients. It doesn't produce symptoms in most celiac. Now, that's a very tiny amount still. And said, okay, well, let's back extrapolate from that and reduce it by a factor of 10, provide a safety margin, and you basically end up with about 20 parts per million. And that was internationally, it wasn't just the FDA, but the Codex Alimentarius kind of agreed on that. Now, a part that was only partially considered in that is, what can we actually measure? You know, how good is our analytes, our analytic measures? And that's obviously Laura's field, especially. And then, you know, that's what they said, is that, okay, if it's less than 20 parts per million, it's highly unlikely that somebody consuming this on a regular basis with celiac disease would suffer harm. So that was basically their approach. Laura, do you want to address the 10 parts per million?
Sure, yeah. So the GFCO went with a 10 parts per million threshold, in part, as Dr. Murray said, because of where the analytical capabilities were at the time. When FDA was working through their regulation, the kits that were validated were working at about 20 ppm. When GFCO came in and started doing certifications, the kits were able to see down at 10 ppm. Another reason that we use the 10 ppm threshold is that when these kits are validated, the margin of error for acceptable results is plus or minus about 50%. So by having a 10 ppm threshold, we're basically guaranteeing it's not ever going to go above 20. So whereas with a 20, you might be seeing a 30 ppm, you know, result.
And I think the other thing to keep in mind too, as Dr. Murray alluded to, you know, different individuals have very different sensitivities. And, you know, we hear from people, some people think that they are fine with 20 ppm products as a regular part of their diet, and other people feel that that's too high for them.
Yeah, and we have been asked if we would reduce the GFCO threshold. There aren't at this point sufficient enough. A lot of the kits can see 5 ppm, but it's mostly the quantitative laboratory methods. So there really aren't enough readily available methods out there at this point for us to drop that.
Okay.
I do want to bring up something about symptoms and thresholds. You know, there is a lot of effective anticipation. So we recently published a study that we did where we did double-blind or sham-controlled gluten challenges in people with celiac disease. And everyone got symptoms. People getting the regular gluten-containing challenge as well as the people with the sham challenge. So anticipation can induce symptoms. And that's a real phenomena. It's not that you don't have symptoms, you do, but it's through anticipation or fear. So I think we have to be aware of that. And for the people who are living gluten-free who don't have celiac disease, it's likely that much of their symptom reactions are not caused by gluten, but are caused by either these sugar alcohols or fructans or other components that are producing those responses, not gluten. And those are also quantity-based, and they need probably even much more of a quantity to induce symptoms than would the simple gluten content. So I think we have to be aware that it's not always gluten. Sometimes it's other parts of wheat that induce symptoms, especially in people who are living gluten-free who don't have celiac disease.
Thank you. Eliza, what's next?
Yes, jumping on to the last two pieces of the FDA questions. Any update to including rye and barley and ingredients lists on labels? Will the FDA be doing anything with that? And also, are there any plans by the FDA to regulate gluten in over-the-counter drugs and prescription medications?
So Laura, maybe you want to address that first part of that question.
Yeah, so not necessarily the FDA, but Congress is now looking at the Food Labeling Modernization Act, which covers a whole lot of food labeling. But one of the things it does include is the addition of rye and barley as items that must be labeled if they're present in a product. There's been a lot of lobbying going on. The Center for Science and the Public Interest is really spearheading a lot of those efforts. but all of the celiac associations, including GIG, are behind that and helping to go meet with, virtually meet with people in Congress. So that's definitely something we're hoping will be passed soon, but we'll see.
And what about in regard to medications, Dr. Murray? Maybe you could comment on that and how you advise.
There has
patients.
been many efforts now over probably 15 years to try and get the drug side of the FDA to regulate incipients. Incipients are the non-active ingredients in drugs. And one particular thing is to make sure they don't contain any allergens. And they've kind of come around to it. Most manufacturers don't want to put anything that's an allergen in there. But gluten has always been kind of kept separate from that because of this quantity threshold. When it comes, there was a study done some years ago on soliciting people's input, and I think I got a glutened by a medication. Identify the medication, identify the lot, and then a pharmacy school, I think it was in New Jersey, then testing those medications to see if they could find gluten. And they found gluten very rarely. So it really is probably very rare that there's a sufficient amount of gluten in a prescription medicine to make someone ill. Where that becomes different is when the medication is of sufficient size. And I'm thinking more of over-the-counter medicines like chewables and things that have a significant mass in themselves. And they have a lot of incipients. What are they? And some of that labeling is not as regulated as the food labeling is. So ironically, we have better regulations on food labeling for gluten-free than we have for over-the-counter or even prescription medicines. But for prescription medicines, it's probably quite rare and quite unlikely that a patient with celiac disease would suffer harm from the tiny amount of gluten that might be present in a very tiny percentage of medicines.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Yeah. Eliza?
Yes, we're getting a lot of questions about a topic that I don't believe we've touched on yet, the skin exposure to gluten.
Mm-hmm.
So topicals, creams, lotions, somebody mentioned getting a massage with a lotion that they had a reaction to and they thought it might be gluten, but the touching of it, what are the thoughts on that?
Yeah, Dr. Murray, what would you say?
So there were experiments done many years ago where people injected gluten under the skin and you would get a reaction in patients with celiac disease, but surprisingly, it wasn't all that great. There's recently been some research work that was done injecting parts of gluten into the skin, and people got GI symptoms within 2 to 4 hours. So potentially gluten, transcutaneous gluten could induce symptoms. Now, most of the time, what you put on your skin is not going to get absorbed. It's just not enough to get into your system. If it's just rubbed onto intact skin. If it's rubbed onto broken skin, that's different. Putting stuff in your hair doesn't matter. And, unless you drink the shampoo, it probably won't matter. But I also advise my patients, why would you choose, if you're a celiac, why would you choose, say, a gluten-containing shampoo? Just why? It doesn't serve any great purpose. It's mostly marketing. So it's mostly stuff that gets into your system. So say lipstick that has got gluten in it that is reapplied frequently, certainly some of that'll get into your system and that could produce a response. Patients with dermatitis herpetiformis are a little different. They already have skin inflammation that's related to gluten. We think that most of the time that skin reaction is happening not because of stuff on their skin, but because of stuff in their gut that produces the skin response, kind of indirectly. Of course, if you've got wheat-induced eczema, that's a whole different issue. Or if you've got wheat-induced contact dermatitis, and there are allergens in wheat that can cause asthma, Baker's asthma, for example, those could produce a pretty nasty skin rash if your skin is exposed in sufficient quantities. But those are different types of responses. And then last of all, there's a very rare condition called wheat-dependent exercise-induced anaphylaxis, where somebody goes on carb loads with wheat pasta, and then they go for a run in their marathon, they drop dead. And that's a very rare, very peculiar immune response. So we have focused on celiac disease and people with gut sensitivities, but there are other types of rare responses to wheat, particularly wheat, not so much rye or barley, that can make some people very ill.
So for the most part, topical application of something containing gluten is not an issue unless it's in lipstick and you're reapplying it extremely frequently and licking your lips a lot, right?
It's not a problem.
Okay.
Also, eye makeup is another one that was mentioned, and you had mentioned the air exposure to gluten getting into eyes or nose or mouth. So what about eye makeup in and around the eye?
It's unlikely to reach that amount of quantity. I have to confess, I don't know about how much quantity somebody would be applying, but I think the amount that would ever get in would be so small as to unlikely to trigger celiac disease. I do see a lot of discussions going by on the chat about medical care for people with celiac disease. And I want to emphasize celiac disease is a medical problem. It causes chronic inflammation in the intestine. There is medically accepted ways of diagnosis and management, and that should usually be applied by knowledgeable physicians who understand the disease and how it's undertaken. I am a strong proponent that if somebody needs a biopsy for celiac disease, it should be done by a gastroenterologist. You're a trained gastroenterologist, and we have plenty of them in America. Not done by somebody who does endoscopy as part of some other practice. It should be done by a gastroenterologist. Almost all now trained gastroenterologists have been exposed to celiac disease training. How well they learn it is, I suppose, very much how well they learn everything else. But there is the professional society for celiac disease called the Society for the Study of Celiac Disease that is trying to kind of raise the knowledge and awareness of celiac disease among medical professionals, especially gastroenterologists.
Thank you for that. Elisa?
Well, we've got a number of questions about people who are asymptomatic. They've been diagnosed with celiac disease, but they just are not really showing symptoms. And yet it's causing them a lot of distress because they have to be hypervigilant. They're isolating themselves. They're anxious, and they're wondering, well, how much damage might be done and what can they do about it because they are asymptomatic.
Those patients, I mean, I suggest, they be prudent, but not paranoid. There's no reason for them to be paranoid. They're going to travel, they're going to eat out. And then I say, well, look, let's follow their lab tests, see how they are, and rebiopsy them to make sure their intestine is healed. And if they've healed their intestine and they're living a reasonable life, then I say, keep up the good work. Now, what will happen if you have relatively asymptomatic celiac disease and you do nothing about it? You'll continue to have inflammation in your intestine, and some proportion of those individuals will get consequences. Some consequences will be mild and easily reversible. Some of them not so. So unfortunately, I will sometimes see patients who were diagnosed 40 years ago with celiac disease. They went gluten-free diet for a few years, and then they kind of went off the diet and have been eating gluten. And then they present with a lymphoma, a disseminated lymphoma at the age of 50. There isn't very much we can do for some of those patients. I won't say it's game over, but it's really bad. And so I think of asymptomatic celiac disease a little bit like asymptomatic high blood pressure. Most people with high blood pressure have no symptoms. Many of them will never have a consequence, but then some of them will get strokes and die. So I prefer to treat high blood pressure, same way I would prefer to treat asymptomatic celiac disease. But again, it's about preserving people's quality of life and enabling them to be gluten-free with the proper type of support that, for example, there are programs like the GIG programs and responsible industry can provide them with foods that are reasonably easy and hopefully nutritious at the same time. So it's all about the whole approach to somebody's health.
Yeah, thank you.
And
for that.
I'm going to put my clinical hat on. I do some work in long-term care, assisted living, and osteoporosis is what I see as a consequence of untreated celiac, asymptomatic people with celiac disease and osteoporosis. younger.
Right.
That's the one that I see. They don't get the lymphoma, they don't get the cancer, but osteoporosis, osteopenia and osteoporosis.
Yeah, we very much, even medically, we underestimate the impact that a hip fracture has on somebody. And it's often what I call the pre-terminal event. Somebody can be in great health, they break a hip at their mid-80s, and then they go downhill and are dead in 3 years. So we shouldn't underestimate that. So Ron, you're perfectly right. That's a consequence that's silent. We need to get to celiac disease earlier if we're going to reverse that fracture risk, because often when you get to 65, if you have bad osteoporosis, possibly be extra bad because of celiac disease, it's not going to be readily reversible. It's going to need a gluten-free diet and expert intervention to try and reduce risk.
Yeah, but so in terms of, people who are sort of wondering how to balance this, being hypervigilant, I mean, I think that we're all really saying that, yes, you need to be on the gluten-free diet. You need to be aware of some of these things we've been talking about, risks in restaurants, et cetera. But as you have said, Dr. Murray, it's prudence, not paranoia. Seems to be sort of the guiding thought that I'm hearing here. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think definitely. And of course, some people feel very impacted in terms of their freedom and anything. And of course, it's something I think now the rest of the world can relate to, the people with celiac disease who've been socially isolated, because everyone has been socially isolated to some degree within because of the pandemic, and can relate to not being able to eat out, not having all those limitations on social activity. And we've already seen, even coming across on the chat, people's suggestions: bring your own food to social activities. I often think that one of the most hazardous places is when you go to somebody's home to get, and you're relying on them. They're not professionals. They haven't been certified. Do they really understand what you have? Isn't it so much easier to bring your own and share that with others after I think somebody even said, I like to take my share first and then share the rest with others, let them serve themselves.
Right.
I mean, that's the type of sensible thing that should just become second nature. And the idea is to make it second nature. Some of the programs you've talked about for teenagers, to let them internalize it so they don't even have to think about it. The other thing that I love about the new generations is they're okay with being different. In my time, we wanted all to fit in. But now our teenagers are totally fine with being different. And I tell people, you don't have to worry about saying that you're on a special diet. We've heard already about the food, people going to a restaurant asking for gluten-free food. I tell my patients to say, I have a medical problem. I have celiac disease. I am not choosing to be gluten-free. I have to be gluten-free. Please respect that. And I think most food servers will get that. And they're not going to put croutons on your meal, I hope.
Yeah. Good point. Elisa, do we have a couple more?
On what gluten is, right?
Right.
Make sure that they understand.
Do we have time for another question?
Maybe
Or do you want to do wrap up?
A couple more, maybe another minute or two.
Well, we've got one question. This person's GI doctor suggested giving up oats, corn, rice, other non-gluten grains to see if they might heal better. And wondering, what do they think about that, about non-gluten grains affecting intestines and immune system?
Probably very little. If it is celiac disease, we're dealing with celiac disease, there really isn't very much value to those. Perhaps the oats, there are a small proportion of patients with celiac disease will react to pure oats. That's a very small proportion, but I will sometimes try that strategy. More effective is moving to a much more conservative diet. If you've got a patient who's failing to heal and they have activity of disease and possibly also positive antibodies despite doing their best being gluten-free, I will tell people about trying an in-the-skin diet. And that's basically, you're talking pure food. You have to be able to visibly identify it as pure food. I would probably also allow them to eat packaged foods that are marked gluten-free. I would not do restaurant food that's called gluten-free. Now that's a bit extreme, I mean, for most people who live in real life, but sometimes we have to do that. And there is at least one paper suggests that you can actually get people to heal if they do that. Now, can they keep it healed? Can they retain that or maintain that? I'm not so sure. And I think the other thing that I've learned is the burden of somebody's management of celiac disease is quite high. And there's been one study out of Boston suggesting that the burden is just as high as people with end-stage kidney failure. Now, you tell that to a doctor and they wouldn't believe you. But you tell that to a patient and they get it. They live it every day. And hence, we and others are trying to come up with other ways of treating celiac disease beyond just a gluten-free diet. So there is real attempts to try and come up with alternatives because people with celiac disease deserve it. Right now, the best avenue for keeping healthy and achieving health is being gluten-free, but there has to be ways to help people beyond that. We have to provide, and that's a challenge to the scientific community, the pharmaceutical industry, and the regulators to come up with things that are safe and effective that can be helpful aids to help people with celiac disease.
Yeah, we'll certainly be watching that. And, in the meanwhile, people should get educated, gain support, all of these things we've been talking about, seek out, validated restaurants or spots that at least, seem to have knowledge regarding what they're doing, and just be aware of the foods that you're choosing to bring into your kitchen so that you can balance out the quality of life with adherence to the gluten-free diet. Well, I think we better wrap up at this point. As Eliza said, we will compile questions that have not been answered. We will be checking back with the three of you, Dr. Murray, Ronnie, and Laura, and we'll put together a blog post that will be up on our website at some point before too long. And we do have one quick poll again for our attendees before we sign off. One of them is basically going to assess what you answered at the beginning to see if your opinions have changed on the matter, and then just some information regarding how you viewed the event to help us plan future events. So thank you for taking a minute on this. All right, well, I would like to thank our panelists very much. Ronnie, Laura, and Dr. Murray, it's been very informative. We really appreciate your joining us. Thank you to everyone for attending. This has been recorded. Everyone who signed up for the event will be receiving a link to the recording probably within a week or two. So thank you so much and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.